Olá, boa tarde a todos. Bem-vindos à Tinta-da-china. Neste caso é mesmo literal, estamos na Tinta-da-china, nos nossos escritórios. É um prazer ter-vos aqui. É também um prazer ter aqui a Maaza, que vem de mais longe para estar connosco. Ela não está a perceber nada do que eu estou a dizer. But I will explain to you later. E o Alberto Manguel, autor da Tinta-da-china, também já há muito tempo. É um prazer tê-lo aqui. Nós estamos aqui para lançar o Rei Sombra, da Maaza Mengiste, um romance que vocês verão surpreendente, fascinante. Além disso, isto é também, como podem ver por esta cor bonita e por este trabalho estético, isto é também o início de uma coleção, de uma nova coleção da Tinta-da-china, dirigida pelo Alberto Manguel, com títulos escolhidos por ele. E a Maaza, que nós já íamos publicar, curiosamente, também encaixou neste processo da coleção e, portanto, é uma alegria que seja o primeiro e que seja este livro. Para falar sobre isso, eles falarão melhor do que eu e passo desde já a palavra ao Alberto Manguel. Obrigada.
Obrigado, boa tarde. Desculpe por meu mal português. Primeiro vou falar, antes de falar de Maaza, vou falar da coleção de Tinta-da-china. Tinta-da-china é o meu editor, mas eu acho que agora faz parte de Tinta-da-china, porque Tinta... estava a dizer que todas as propostas que estou a fazer a Tinta-da-china arribam na Tinta-da-china e depois de um largo tempo estão a fazer os livros. Mas essas coisas mais importantes estão a fazer os livros. E quando empezamos o RTP 3 com Ana Daniela, onde está Ana Daniela? Ana Daniela é a minha alma gemela. E então, quando estamos a fazer conversas em nosso programa, A Vida, Privada dos Livros, muitas vezes falamos de um livro que não está traduzido em Portugal. Então, Bárbara e Catarina diz: podemos fazer esses livros que não estão traduzidos em Portugal. E o primeiro é o livro de Maaza. O livro de Maaza é uma obra-prima. Se vocês verem o programa de Ana Daniela esta noite, vamos a falar de este livro esta noite em RTP3. E a coleção, por que A Vida Privada dos Livros? Porque cada leitor tem sua biblioteca privada. Há uma biblioteca pública de cada leitor. Sim, muito bem, conhecemos os clássicos, conhecemos Saramago, conhecemos Quixote, conhecemos Pessoa, mas outros autores são íntimos, são privados. Então, surpreende muito que um autor que é muito importante para nós não seja conhecido por nossos amigos, porque não foi traduzido, porque não foi publicitado, porque a editorial acabou. Então, esta vida privada dos livros em Tinta-da-china vai ser um assunto de renascimento, de coisas que já foram escritas, mas não foram lidas. Então, vamos a criar leitores com esta série. Eu prometo-lhes que estas obras são extraordinárias e vão gostar muito.
Yes, Alberto was translating, was saying something about the collection, but maybe if you want to say a few words about the book, we can.
Of course.
I don't know if everyone is okay with it, but maybe you can say it in English so that Maaza can understand. I don't know. That's okay for you?
Would you prefer to be spared my horrible
No, your Portuguese is great. It is just now to talk about the book. Maybe for Maaza it's nicer if we speak
So,
English.
what can I say about The Shadow King? It's a horrible book. I discovered the Shadow King just by chance. You know, a title attracts you, and you open the book, and suddenly you are caught in that book. And I was really caught in Maaza's story. I had read Maaza's previous novel, The Lion, Beneath the Lion's Skin, and it impressed me enormously as one of the strongest descriptions, accounts of the Italian colonial war in Ethiopia. In every European country, we have our colonial histories, but we seldom know about the colonial histories of the other countries, about the other languages. And there is a huge ignorance in the rest of Europe, and even in Italy up to a certain point, about the history of that colonial period where Mussolini wanted to take part of Africa, like to buy Greenland. So Maaza's chronicle in the first book is the story of that colonial war, but through the eyes of a very peculiar hero. Maaza doesn't doesn't describe conventional heroes. You won't find the hero of a novel of chivalry in Maaza's book. They are very strange creatures. The hero of the Lion's Skin, why don't I remember the title properly? It's a long one, and my memory is short. Beneath the Lion's Skin, the hero there is a doctor whose job is to heal prisoners so that they can torture again. So can you imagine that ethical, moral, human situation? In the case of the Shadow King, I wouldn't say there is one hero. There are several in different groups. There is the Shadow King, which is this man who unfortunately resembles Haile Selassie, and so he is used, as so many dictators have, to stand for the dictator in different dangerous situations. But that is the apparent hero. The real heroes are, above all, the women and the women soldiers. Maaza might tell us how he discovered one particular woman soldier, but I don't think that when we read novels, it's important to know the documentary background. The novel might stand for its own, and Maaza's novel stands as a true masterpiece of our look back at the colonial period and how it affects us today. Because what Maaza does in that book, in telling us that story of recent past, she shows us how an event in the past ripples into the present, and we are all affected somehow by that ripple. But maybe we must talk a little about change gears. Okay, Maaza can tell us a little about the creation of the novel. Writers don't like usually to talk about their workshop, but in this case, Maaza, I think, will tell us about where the story was born.
I have to say first that it's really wonderful to see so many familiar and new faces here, and to be in Lisbon and to be speaking with my dear friend Alberto, whom I have known, I think, across several countries, Italy and then the United States and now here. He wrote an incredible and moving introduction to this book, and I am eternally grateful for that. The idea for the novel came through many steps, which is why I think it took many years, and I missed many deadlines getting to this end. But initially, I had heard the stories of the men in my family who fought against the Italians, the men in our neighborhood, old men by the time I was a child, who had fought against the Italians. Always, if someone walked into our house, the reference would be, oh, this is so-and-so who fought in this battle against the Italians. This is so-and-so's granddaughter, who is the granddaughter of this man who fought in this war. It was a lineage that came from that war. So I was always referencing that aspect of history. The stories I heard about those men were stories of defiance, stories of courage, stories of real cunning and intelligence. The Ethiopians were poorly equipped, were working with rifles, if they had them, that were 40 or 50 years old. They were charging against tanks, often charging with their bare hands. They were charging into cannons and into modern artillery. They would charge until the Italian bullets ran out, and then a new row would come up and move in. If you can imagine for a child hearing those stories, it becomes a myth. It becomes a legend. And I grew up thinking, this is an incredible history that I come from. It was a story that I wanted to write as a novelist, but I knew I wasn't ready as a first book. I had to practice. I lived in Italy for a while to do this research, and I can talk about it a little bit more, but over the course of this research, I discovered that there were women who fought in this, and this was a story that I had never heard. I had in fact never heard my grandmother's generation of women speak about their experience. They sat quietly while the war was talked about, or they would say, well, we took care of the sick, we collected the dead, we buried them, but there was never really any other discussion. And stumbling upon these details of women, for me, was a revelation. I had not ever heard of this, and it completely changed the book, which was another reason that I missed many deadlines, because I had to start again. I had written a book with men at the center, but once I started asking the question, what does it mean to be a woman at war? Who is the enemy when you're a soldier on the front lines and you become a woman back in the camp? And I won't. Oh, that photo. So, okay, this is a story. Okay, here we go. I had. There's a photograph that I found, but maybe before that I can talk a little bit about how I came to look at photographs as a document of war. When I was living in Italy, I was doing a presentation on my first book, which is set during the revolution in Ethiopia of 1974. I was traveling to the southern part of Italy, to Calabria, and I knew in Calabria that in 1935, most of the foot soldiers of Italy came from the south. The officers, those who were educated and became the commanding officers in the military, came from the industrialized and richer north. So the southern part, which was the agricultural part, was where those foot soldiers went, and they experienced the war in Ethiopia. And I wondered if I was going to encounter any of this history while I was there. In my presentation at a very tiny bookstore, I think the number of people it was really, really tiny. At the end of this, there was a man who stood up and said, I would like to talk about 1935. And when he said that, the entire room went quiet. And there were people I could hear saying, not now, this is not the time. But he insisted, and he said, I want to talk about 1935. He said, my father was a pilot during this war. He dropped the poison gas on your people. And he started crying. And he said, how do I ask for your forgiveness? I was surprised, I was moved, it was emotional, and he was weeping at that point, and the room was really tense. And I said something to him to the effect of, if we have a dialogue, if we have a conversation, this is a way to begin to reconcile. And he said at that point, please don't leave until I come back. He left, and soon after, he came back with a self-published book of his father's diaries, letters, and photographs. And he said, this is for you. Take it and do what you want with it. So I took it back to my apartment in Rome. And in looking through this, there were a few things that I realized. Number one, the book that I had been writing was a book that I had written in deep anger. Deep anger. You cannot write a book in anger. I know I can't. I couldn't. It was a bad book. I had written a book in anger, and what I saw in this young man, the father of this man that I talked to, in this young man's diaries, was someone who had come from a small town, who had no real education, who was going to move and leave his home and go farther than he has ever gone in his entire life. Someone who thought he was going for an adventure and who encountered a brutal war, and that war deformed him. And I saw in the tears of this son a man that couldn't understand how this father that he loved could also do these things that he wrote about in his diary. And so the pain of those tears came from love for this son had, and confusion about his father. And I also saw that the photographs were telling me a kind of story about daily life in war, which is about friendship, which is about boredom, which is about meeting people who are locals, sometimes the complicated relationships that would develop. And I was not finding any of this history in the archives and the documents that the fascists had saved. It was a curated version of history. So I left the libraries at that point, and I'm coming to your question, and started looking for photographs in flea markets, started looking for diaries, letters, anything. In the course of collecting photographs, I now have a collection, an archive of my own. I stumbled upon a photograph of a woman in uniform with a gun, a soldier from Ethiopia. And I realized at that point that I had hit something new that I hadn't understood before. Once I started looking again through papers and newspapers, I started finding a headline in the New York Times, November 1935, woman general leads 2,000 men to victory. South African anti-apartheid newspapers were photographing and reporting on these women in 1935. The world knew about this, but somehow it got lost in history, and the entire book had to change. So I went back to writing again.
Am I misremembering, but did you not find that photo among your mother's papers that she said, you asked who is this?
I did not find that photograph, but that story is another part. It is actually another part of this. After many years of writing this book and being almost finished, I was finished with the book and had to take a last-minute research trip one more time with my mother. Well, I didn't have to go with her. She just goes with me everywhere. And she wanted to go with me on this 10-day trip with my cousin. And we were going through Ethiopia, driving, visiting different sites that I needed, battle sites that I had already written about. 10 days of talking about the book, talking about the history, talking about the women, talking about everything. We come back home to Addis Ababa, and I tell her about this photograph and that I found of the woman with the rifle and the uniform, and she says to me quite casually, which is what Alberto remembers well, she said to me, well, what about your great-grandmother? And I remember my first thing was, I said, there's something wrong with my ears. You know, there's something. I said, what did you say? And she said, well, your great-grandmother. She got her father's gun. She was married to a man who was much too old for her. It was an arranged marriage. She was still living at home because she could not be a proper wife to an adult man. There was a mobilization call that came throughout Ethiopia in 1935. The eldest of every family, get your gun, because every family had a gun that was often 40 or 50 years old. It was for livestock. My grandmother lived in a village, or great-grandmother. And the call from Haile Selassie was, the eldest in the family, get your family's gun and go to the front lines. Begin to mobilize. The Italians are coming. My great-grandmother was the eldest in her family. She said, I'll go. And her father said, no, you won't. You're too young and you're a girl. I will give my gun to your husband. And he will go in our name and represent our family. I don't know what transpired between them. But my great-grandmother, as I've always heard, was very strong-willed, was quite a small woman, but really, really fierce. So whatever arguments happened between father and daughter, she sued him for his gun. She stood in front of the village judges and said, I am the rightful heir to this gun. I am the eldest in the family. This is a mobilization call, and I will go. She won her case. And the story is, as everyone says, that when she won the case, she took the rifle and held it up in her hand and started singing the song that warriors sing just before they go off to war. And she went. It's an incredible story. It could have saved me years of research. And when I asked my mother, why didn't you tell me this before? She said, you never asked. And so after the shock of that, I had to think about why I never asked. Why didn't I ask? why did I assume that the carriers of history were only the men in my family? Why hadn't someone told me this? And I realized that my great-grandmother's story was passed down to her daughter, and her daughter passed it down to her daughter in the spaces where women gather. Those kitchen stories that we think of as just the stories women tell and girls speak was also history. But I had always assumed that whatever I heard in the spaces where men appear is really where history happens. So what I have now been doing, and I send this challenge to all of you, is I will ask a relative, tell me something you haven't told me. And I've been keeping track of the stories. So I would challenge all of you to do that.
You can see why she was such an extraordinary writer. She knows how to find stories, even if they come a little late. Thank you, Maaza.
Não sei se querem aproveitar alguém para fazer uma pergunta à Maaza. Temos aqui a autora, se alguém quiser avançar com uma pergunta. Alberto wants to make a question.
We spoke about some of the characters, and you spoke about the importance of photography as a source. There's one character that we haven't spoken about, and it's an Italian photographer. So can you tell us a little how that came about and who is he in your imagination?
Ettore. Ettore is Italian, he is Jewish, he is the son of a man born in Ukraine and fled the pogroms in the early 1900s and moved as far as he could away from Odessa, which was Italy, for him. When the war starts and Ettore is enthusiastic and enlists in Mussolini's army and goes into Ethiopia, he takes his camera to war. And Leo Navarra, his father, is writing him letters saying, are you sure you know what you're doing? Are you walking in shadow or are you walking in light in that country? Ettore, with his camera, questions some of the things that I have questioned about images, about memory, and I think about the way that we use photographs to recraft and manipulate not just memory but also history, and how we want to imagine those people we call enemies or those we call our friends or our allies. Ettore, with his camera, begins to document, under the orders of Colonel Pucelli, begins to document the atrocities that Pucelli enacts on Ethiopians. But Ettore begins to ask himself what it means to be a soldier, what it means to be moral, and whether morality is possible in war. What complicity means versus what it means to follow orders. And when he encounters Hirut, who is a young woman in the Ethiopian army, who is a soldier, and I don't want to say more, but they meet. He has to question who is really a soldier, who is really the enemy, who is the creature and the beast in this war. I was interested in Ettore and the photographs because number one, I knew that Mussolini, as most colonial powers, begin to speak of conquest even before invasion by creating a narrative of Africans, by creating a narrative of people that they will subjugate. First, they have to make us all believe that they are something other. And if you can begin to define a group of people only in terms of their bodies, only in terms of their physicalness, you can make those bodies into political statements. And if you can make those bodies into political statements, you can crush their souls. And I wondered what it would feel like for a soldier to participate in that, to create these images that are really propaganda and they are lies, but they are what people see. So is that the truth? What it does to him when he is doing this, and then soon when Italy passes its anti-Semitic laws, he becomes the enemy, and he finds himself in an unstable territory with Hirut and in Ethiopia. So I work with images in here, but I work with Ettore behind the camera, but he's wondering who's really in control.
Just one more thing. This novel has so many narrative levels of description, levels of point of view, different voices for the characters. The translation into Portuguese is a miracle, and I'd like to, and Maaza, homage to that translator who is a...
Raquel Moura, não. É a Raquel Moura, que já fez outros livros connosco. Ela não pôde vir, mas já tinha compromissos neste fim de semana. But she couldn't come, but she sent you her highest regards. Alguém quer fazer alguma pergunta à Maaza? There. I will go and then I'll come back. No?
Can I ask in Italian? Sorry, in English? So I'm Italian, but I've never had a chance to talk about the book with my friends or peers. And I was wondering, since it has been published already in Italy some time ago, what has been the reception there, which feedback you got from there, what, I don't know, what the new generation says about these as regards their grandparents or...
Thank you. I've heard from a lot of Italians very much what you have just said, that they haven't talked about this war, not only with their peers, but with family members. Usually when the men came back from war, Ethiopia was not discussed at all. So it just remained an open secret in a family. And since the book has been published, I have received messages from Italians telling me that this is one of the first times that they have been able to talk about. There's a reason now to talk about this history. So the reception has been, it's been positive, but I also am really aware that it's an uncomfortable history. And but the way that I have received requests from Ethiopians sometimes asking me if I can help them find relatives or the remains of relatives who were disappeared by Italians. In the same way, I receive messages and requests from Italians asking me if I will help them locate relatives that perhaps never came home, or the fascists just wouldn't admit that so many people died, so nobody knows what happened. This war it devoured everyone, not just one side. But since the book has been published, from people who are interested, I have received really incredible responses. Of course, we know the far right is growing in Italy, and those far right journalists or those readers that have read the book have obviously attacked it. They can't deny the history of it, but what they can do is, I think, try to deny the legitimacy of what we're talking about. But the conversations are continuing there, and I think in good ways. Thank you.
Mais alguém quer fazer uma pergunta à Maaza? Temos aqui.
So my question is about process. I'm Maaza's cousin.
This is my cousin.
What
What is she going to ask me?
It's a real question. You mentioned writing the book earlier from a place of anger, and then that shifting after that bookstore. And sometimes anger does feel like a useful emotion to like get started. So I'm curious about how the writing changed and what other emotions you started embodying as you know, this version.
That's a really good question. He's going to release some family secret. Oh, no. When I say I was writing anger, and I would literally walk through the streets of Italy, walk through the streets of Rome and say, if any Italian looks at me the wrong way, I am going to say something or punch them if I'm bigger, which most of the time I wasn't. I had this thing, I had a chip on my shoulder, and it's because the history felt so present. Once I met that man, what I understood was that these were men, those soldiers and that history that I was so angry about, and the writing was quite rigid. There was a very clearly defined good and moral side, and there was a very clear, simple cruelty on the other side, and everybody was enacting their roles without any mercy, without any conflict of anything except this happened, this happened, this happened, and now we know who the good guy is and the bad guy. In the process of revision, I had to think about the way that cruelty is not cruelty unless you also see the option and sometimes the possibility of compassion in the same person. That the presence of a compassionate act makes a cruel act even much crueler. So Carlo Fucelli in the book, as awful as he is, if I didn't give him moments where he does something surprising, then those cruel acts are just flat. Because people are kind and cruel. People hate and love. They are hated and beloved. And so how does that work in the same human being? And that's what had to change. And it wasn't just the Italians. I had to go back and do the same thing with the Ethiopians. There is no clean hero. I think one of the books that I read many, many years ago was a biography of Che Guevara. And the journalist, John Lee Anderson, that wrote that biography, rendered him in a way that let me see both the heroic acts, but the acts that I completely despised and that I questioned. And that's what makes a public figure. This is how people do not get ahead simply by doing very gentle kind of things necessarily, not in war or revolution. And that had to come out with all of these characters. Thank you.
I know there's a question in the back.
We mentioned can you hear me okay? Yeah. We mentioned the translation and translation. Indulge me.
Could you speak a bit about the translation? As a translator, I'm interested in it. Did Raquel ask you lots of questions? And how did it compare to being translated into other languages? Were there particular Portuguese things?
I can speak about what I imagine is the challenge for people who translate this book. Maybe I could do a little bit about that. Partly, I know this book is dense in terms of the language because I intended for the sentences to carry the weight meaning that one of the questions I wanted to ask in the book was not just about history, not just about memory, but also to think about how much can language contain, how much weight I put on language, so that in moments of terror and maybe real trauma for my characters, the language is so much of that it becomes beautiful. The language can become an escape in moments of violence. I don't know if that makes sense, but I think that in real life, that all of us are wired to handle more than we think we can bear. And those stories that we sometimes hear that come out of war, that come out of prisons, are stories of people who survived because the imagination stepped in and it gave them mercy. It gave them a cushion. And I think that we all are built with these pockets of mercy. And that's what language is. That's what imagination is. So how can, in this book, language carry the weight of this? So I had to work with moments of real brutality to create a language that made it bearable, to create imaginative leaps in language in those moments when it was hardest, if that makes sense. So I know that the translation is a true Barbara, because I know that the translation is a challenge, because even in English it's not so easy. I work the closest with my Italian translator because I speak Italian, and she would send me pages and we would go back and forth with talking about this. And I know through her the challenges of sometimes the image that I was creating with English words, and there was just no Italian equivalent because there was one word that it wasn't quite right. It didn't have the spin of something that I was working with. One word that we spent a week, maybe, on was the word grim, G-R-I-M. We could not find an Italian equivalent in that to carry the meaning, not the literal meaning, but the meaning of it in a sentence. And we went around and around and around, and every Italian word both of us could think of, we had written it down, and every English alternative, and we literally had to give up and just go with something that we thought was okay. So I can imagine the work of this translation, and I really owe a lot to the translators. Sometimes they call me afterwards, and they're like, "Oh my God, we finished." And yeah, sometimes two people have had to do it. So yeah, I thank you for that, Jethro. But it's part of language is only an approximation. It's never an exact of what we can feel and think. And so I think that I admire the work of translators. The work that you do is just, it's a labor of love on top of everything else. So thank you for that.
Let's try this one.
Hello. Thank you so much for the presentation. I wanted to ask you, why do you think that women don't talk more about their acts of bravery in the war, in that particular war and in general, and how do men feel about women being involved in the war?
No, I know. So let me start with the second one. How do men feel about women in war? We can look at statistics, and I can go with the American military right now, and the numbers of women who are abused in the army. Men do not know what to do when a woman is also a soldier, because we have been told for so long that the military makes men out of boys. And so when a woman goes into the military, what does it say about manhood? If you are retreating from an oncoming army, and they have women in their front lines, what does that mean about you? If you are fighting and a woman is fighting next to you, what does it mean about your strength? It makes the questions of masculinity get it's so much the world of the military that women I think have a very hard time, and it's not because they have a hard time, it's because men make it difficult for them. So I think it makes most or a lot of men uncomfortable, and that has been the case. And I think this is why we don't hear about all the women involved in revolutions and liberation movements. We hear one or two and think, well, those are exceptions. We never think that that might have been a normal thing. The first woman in war was recorded 400 something BC. This is not new at all. But every time we hear it, it's as if it's the first time, and that's a sign. Women don't talk about this a lot, partly because no one may listen to them once this war or conflict is. But I think women also don't know what to do with aggression, with their capabilities for aggression, because we're not taught that aggression is good for us. It is in men. But women are not supposed to be aggressive or assertive or ambitious. No one knows what to do with an angry woman except make her into a witch or whatever else we've created around women who don't fit certain roles. So women feel uncomfortable with that level of power. And the things that women have to do, the way that men don't want to talk about what they do in war, women don't necessarily want to talk about it either. But it's also, the language is more difficult because you're speaking as a woman and the role is much more complicated.
And somehow aggression is not an emotion.